So, Ton,
That's
do you have
wonderful.
a comment or a question for us?
Yes, I do. It actually also relates to the dichotomy, or kind of almost like a forced maybe dichotomy between Dickinson and Whitman. Because I was kind of revising before the webcast today and was reading Dickinson, and I caught myself thinking that maybe Dickinson and Whitman are not as different as we think they are in terms of what their writing does. But the difference is that they do have, I started actually seeing differently, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is I was, reading Dickinson and listening to the discussion while, sitting in my beautiful room, eating freshly washed, grapes. And I leave the house maybe once a day. And I'm very selective about who visits me and everything. And I was like, wow, she actually does also luxuriate in the language. Her voice, her words sound tasty and beautiful and kind of juicy almost, but in a different way from Whitman. And as a deaf person, like sound is important to me. And then I started thinking about something that you said, which was that, and not just you, but it is a recurring theme in week one, that Dickinson's writing and Dickinson's poetry is not as democratic as Whitman. And I'm kind of shifting to disagreeing with that, actually, and challenging it.
Great.
What I mean here is Dickinson is definitely selective, but even in the writing at Dwell in Possibility, she still writes in the visitor. The visitor is there.
Yeah.
And not even implied, it is there in the writing. And so it almost is like implied as if she has visitors pretty regularly. And yes, the visitors are selected, but as a woman, it probably is a matter of like safety. My mother checks the lock on the door 55 times because we come from the 90s, and in the 90s, people were killed if you didn't do that. While Whitman reminds me as a combination of a drunk girl in a bar and my own father, because it's like I love everyone because I assume that everyone is like me and I don't care how much space I actually give them.
Wow. Ton.
And his writing is big. His writing is beautiful. It's also, I don't know, I have like an image of like a burger when you're drunk. It's like great. But how much is there for you,
Yeah.
It's like I am open to everyone. So to whom are you actually open?
Wow.
And so I tend to now think that maybe Dickinson is actually more democratic in her writing, because she at least tells you if you are creative, if you, I don't know, do fun things with your brain and indulge in creativity, then, we can be friends. And with Whitman, it's just like everybody can be friends with him. Does it make sense?
Ton, I love that question. Would you hang up and we're going to give you responses to your fabulous erosion of the old binarism that we set up in this course. All right, thank you. That's Ton. Wow, we have so much to reply, but I'm going to ask everybody to speak briefly to these issues. Gabby, Kanar, Amber Rose, and then I'm adding Erica to that. So 4 of you. Quick responses to any aspect of this. I have a feeling a lot of people who are watching this webcast are going to be really interested, because this questions one of the basic premises of week one, which is a silly premise, but a premise that causes discussion. Gabby first, then Kanar.
Yeah. I mean, the distinction is useful pedagogically, but the thing that Dickinson and Whitman both share at this moment that we're really interested in is that they stage the idea that poetry is a form of access to the world, a way of getting into it, a way of kind of interfacing with it. So both, I think, would agree with the Whitmanian line of like, in Canto 2, have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? That equivalency between like getting into the land, getting into the poem. I think both of them actually totally work with that. The distinction that I see that is like most saleable is that one, Whitman sees that mission as being kind of equivalent to building a really big blank verse project that doesn't have so much of an internal architecture. It's more expansive. It's more written out. It follows its own sort of logic to end results as often as it can. Whereas the Dickinson, I feel, is more about internal architectures. It's more about like micro movements between parts. It's more about structured pieces. And so what we have is two people who are realizing the same sort of like aesthetic goal in two very different ways. And that I think is what ends up so appealing about the distinction to me.
That was great. My gosh. I hope someone's transcribing all this. Thank you, Gabby. We're going to go to Kanar. You want to add something, Kanar?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some reason, Dickinson's kind of invocation of the athletic when he's talking about democracy was kind of on my mind in trying to parse this distinction a little bit more. And just kind of thinking about the sort of able, kind of agile, mobile figure that we get in Dickinson, in Whitman. But you know, that kind of agility, I think also maybe accomplishes a certain kind of flattening or leveling where, you know, potential footholds are lost. And thinking with the footholds still, in Dickinson, we actually have, in fact, so many footholds, whether it be the dash or a line break, these kinds of moments of anchorage that then do, I think, open into this really broad spectrum of perhaps we might say more democratic possibility. And in part because they're so frequent, those kinds of notes of kind of landing that you have with Dickinson. So yeah, that's my thought.
That's really great. And implicit in what you've just said is something that Gabby started us on, which is accessibility. If we think about many definitions of accessibility, it turns out that Dickinson is very accessible because of all these ways in. That's very cool. Thank you. Amber Rose and then Erica. Amber Rose, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a brief thought that I came to mind when Gabby was talking about both of them being interested in poetry as a way of interacting with or accessing the world. Yeah, okay, so the word that I want to put out is relation, because it's a word that I am often thinking with, and I think both of these writers are trying to get at sort of the nitty-gritty, really the poetics, like how they are in relation to others. And for Whitman, that's maybe much more forward, but I think Dickinson is doing the same thing, but is taking a different route. Dickinson is kind of thinking about her condition, her living condition, her thinking condition, her writing conditions, right? And how that weighs against the world's binaries. And each and every time she's refusing. I know that there's this binary between me and the world. I know that there's this binary between me and you. I know that there's this binary between right and wrong or sense and nonsense or whatever. And she's always trying to like blur that line. And I think Whitman is also trying to get us to think about kind of the murkiness of relation in this place where we overlap and are kind of porous and filtering in and out of each other. So yeah, I definitely think that there's a lot that they're speaking to.
Nice. Thank you, Amber Rose. We're kind of getting to what we hoped week one of ModPo would get people to, which is to see them both as radical poets, radical in the sense that they are so different from the poets of their time. Radical poets using different means to get at something of the same, which is a definition of poetry as challenging every convention you could possibly think of, including the way we think about poetry itself. So there's that, and I think several of you have said that. Erica Kaufman, one last take on this fabulous riff of Tan's.
I think my contribution will be to kind of underscore things that I heard Amber Rose and Gabby saying about the, you know, Whitman's externalness and Dickinson's internalness. And the thing I'm thinking about is how this relationality happens within the way the poems are built. Like in Dickinson, in the previous question, we're thinking about how much can happen in a single dash. And in Whitman, I think the same could be said of the punctuation. So these are the moments where the reader is forging or figuring out what the relationships are and confronting the way that the poems ask us to rethink relationships.
Thank you so much, Erica, and all of you. And thanks to Tan again.